The anime opens by depicting the monotonous life of a Japanese salaryman who endured being shoved around on a packed commuter train every morning and barely managed to catch the last train home each night. That dull routine defined his existence until the moment he was reincarnated into another world and appointed as the lord of a remote village he was meant to develop using his abilities. However, one day, he awakens and immediately notices how small his hands have become. Realizing that he is now inhabiting the body of a child, he rushes toward a nearby window and looks outside, only to see an expansive kingdom he does not recognize at all. His confusion is abruptly interrupted when his personal maid panics and hurriedly pulls him away from the window, warning him of the danger. He apologizes for worrying her and explains that the scenery was simply so magnificent that it overwhelmed him. The maid is startled by his vocabulary and wonders where a child so young could have learned such complex expressions. This revelation deeply confuses him, and he realizes that while he possesses vague memories of having lived here before, this situation closely resembles the reincarnation stories he once knew. He correctly identifies the maid as Till, his personal attendant, and when she confirms it, he also realizes that his name is Van Ferdio, often called Van. Till is delighted that he can properly say his family name. To her further surprise, he correctly recalls his father's name, Jalpa, the Marquess of the Fercio house, as well as the names of his three older brothers, Mercia, Jard, and Sesto. However, despite knowing all of this, he remains unaware of his current location. Later that morning, the family gathers for breakfast. Van sees his father, Maris Jalpabul Atio, and his brothers, Mercia Eligo Fercio, the eldest, Jard Giercio, the second son, and Sesto Eleo, the third. During the meal, Van is showered with affection by the maids, who constantly praise and spoil him. Although he privately finds the situation amusing, he accepts it without complaint. From this, he concludes that he has been reborn into this world while retaining all memories from his life in Japan. That is the only certainty he has for now. During breakfast, Maris Ferdio asks his sons about their studies for the day. Jard nervously reports that he will be studying fire magic and battle formations, while Sesto explains that he will focus on magic studies. When Van is asked the same question, he calmly states that there is much he does not yet understand and that he wishes to begin by learning about the nation's culture and history. This sophisticated answer from a 2-year-old shocks everyone present. His father, however, smiles before laughing loudly, clearly pleased. He remarks that he had worried about spoiling Van due to being the youngest child born to his late wife, Mira, but now believes Van to be a fine young lad. Confident that Van will inherit powerful fire magic like both his parents, Maris declares that the future of House Ferdio is secure and eagerly anticipates Van's magical aptitude appraisal at age 8. Through this conversation, Van learns that magical aptitude holds great importance in this world. Individuals with offensive magical abilities are highly valued for their role in protecting society. Noble families strongly desire heirs with aptitude for one of the 4 elemental magics: fire, water, wind, or earth. Those who possess other types of magic are considered disgraceful. Knowing that his father and brothers all possess elemental magic, Van understands the immense expectations placed upon him. Determined to better understand the world, he begins asking Till countless questions. She explains that ships can only safely sail from the kingdom's main port due to massive sea monsters inhabiting the deep ocean. She also tells him about the many races that exist, including elves and dwarves, before being stopped by other maids who worry the information is too complex for him. Van reassures Till that he genuinely wants to learn more. When he asks about magical tools, she eagerly explains the existence of magic crystals, gemstones, and ores capable of storing magic. These materials can be used to create tools aligned with one's magical aptitude. Their discussion is interrupted when the butler, Espada, suddenly places a large stack of books in front of Van. Though aware that Van is officially learning basic literacy and numeracy, Espada wishes to assess his true abilities. Van finds the veteran butler intimidating and nervously admits that his reading is poor and that he can only perform simple arithmetic. Espada immediately tests him by holding up 3 fingers on one hand and 2 on the other. When Van answers correctly, Espada decides on the spot to become his tutor. Unable to refuse, Van is subjected to grueling daily lessons. As a result, he learns to read and write within weeks and spends the next 2 years studying relentlessly from dawn until dusk. By the age of 4, Van begins sword training and often spars with Till, who easily dodges his attacks and teases him. During one such session, other maids intervene, accusing Till of disrespecting a noble. When they demand punishment, Van is confused, as he feels no offense. The head maid explains that such behavior would normally be considered a crime. Instead of issuing a harsh punishment, Van simply flicks Till's forehead and declares the matter resolved, leaving everyone stunned. Van continues studying swordsmanship daily, and by age 5, he can fight evenly with older trainee soldiers. His prior life experience gives him an edge, and soon he gains a reputation as a prodigy. Despite his noble status, he treats children of lower rank kindly and ensures their safety after each duel. During a break, Van meets Dee, the deputy commander of the chivalric order. Dee notices the lack of calluses on Van's hands and realizes that his academic training is far more intense than his physical one. Shocked to learn that he has been studying 3 times harder than others, Van begins to understand how abnormal his upbringing has been. Dee insists on personally training him in swordsmanship, promising to go easy due to his age. This promise proves false, as Van is forced through brutal exercises daily. Though exhausted, Van finds joy in this new life, experiencing a sense of fulfillment he never felt before. By age 6, however, the constant pressure becomes overwhelming. Wanting to enjoy his childhood, Van deliberately decides to slack off. He visits the marketplace for the first time, where he witnesses a man attempting to sell his own child into slavery. Horrified, Van intervenes and purchases the boy, Kamsin, granting him safety. Due to noble restrictions, Kamsin must officially become Van's slave to enter the mansion. Though uneasy, Van agrees for Kamsin's protection. The contract is sealed, and Kamsin begins working at the mansion, eventually growing healthier and more confident. As Van approaches his 8th birthday, anticipation spreads across the kingdom for his magical appraisal. Expectations are shattered when it is revealed that Van possesses no elemental magic and instead has production magic, widely regarded as useless. Enraged, his father nearly kills him before Mercia intervenes, proposing that Van be sent to govern a remote, undeveloped village instead. The proposal is accepted, and Van is exiled under the guise of becoming a lord. Though the situation is grim, Van looks forward to a peaceful, laid-back life. Despite his father's intention to send him away quietly, his departure becomes public due to Dee's actions. As Van leaves the capital, the people gather to give him a heartfelt farewell. Surprised and touched, Van waves back, sincerely thanking them all as he begins the next chapter of his life. The journey toward the new city stretched on longer than expected, the road winding through forests and plains still unfamiliar to Van and his companions. Along the way, Van demonstrated his remarkable affinity for production magic. With a simple gesture and focused intent, he shaped raw materials into usable tools, repairing damaged equipment and creating necessities with ease. His companions watched in awe, whispering among themselves about the rare talent they were witnessing. Yet, despite their admiration, Van himself felt conflicted. While his magic was powerful, he privately lamented its lack of obvious combat applications. In a world where strength often meant survival, production magic felt strangely misplaced in his hands. However, before they could proceed, the carriage came to an abrupt halt. The sudden stop sent a ripple of tension through the group. Looking ahead, they quickly realized the cause. Smoke rose in the distance, and the village gates were surrounded. The settlement was under siege. Van immediately gathered his companions to assess the situation. Dee, ever composed, surveyed the scene and concluded that bandits were responsible. Van observed the formation carefully. Archers surrounded the village from all sides, loosing arrows toward the gate. Yet something was off, the arrows seemed strangely ineffective. The villagers huddled behind the gates, frozen with fear, unable to respond. Van quickly estimated the enemy's numbers. Around 50 attackers, far more than their own party. Dee proposed a direct assault, confident that cooperation would secure victory. One of the hired adventurers objected, arguing that charging an enemy force of that size was reckless. Dee acknowledged the danger but countered that he had fought on the front lines many times. He did not deny that there would be casualties, but insisted there was still a viable way to fight. The adventurer reminded him that their contract only covered escort duty. Risking their lives to defend a village was beyond their obligation. Dee responded firmly, stating that this village was the first territory of his lord, the first place to shelter the people under his rule. If they would not draw their swords now, then when would they? Though the adventurer respected Dee's sense of honor, he insisted that such ideals did not apply to mercenaries. Understanding the mercenaries' stance, Dee nonetheless pleaded that they at least protect Van. Espada immediately objected. He argued that if Dee were to fall, the territory would have no future, even if the village was reclaimed. Then, to everyone's shock, Espada revealed his true capabilities. Despite his advanced age, he was a mage capable of wielding all 4 elements. He proposed a strategy. He would raise a barrier to shield the adventurers while they attacked from afar. Once the enemy focused their attention on the barrier, Dee and his men would strike from the flanks in a coordinated assault. The plan promised a high chance of success. When Van asked if Espada intended to fight, The butler answered calmly that he must. Otherwise, he would serve only as bait, leading to the deaths of Dee and the others. Van refused to accept the possibility of losing his butler. He also urged Dee not to take unnecessary risks. Dee was not just a warrior, but the group's strategist. Losing him would cripple the territory before it could even take shape. Van then offered himself as bait. His mate immediately rejected the idea. Khamsin volunteered as well, but Van refused. He explained that he could not bear to watch someone he loved die. He insisted that Khamsin must live a long life as a free man. Overriding further objections, Van resolved to advance mounted on the carriage, drawing the enemy's attention from the front while the others launched attacks from the sides. He reassured them that his daily swordsmanship training with the vice commander of the knights would keep him alive. Privately, however, Van accepted another possibility. If he died protecting his people, it would be an honorable end for a lord. He silently hoped that if he fell, his body would be discarded and his identity hidden, sparing his family any trouble. The adventurers watched this exchange in silence. Among themselves, they admitted they had never encountered a truly benevolent noble, only arrogant ones. Van was different. One of them, previously reluctant, decided he wished to remain in the territory of Marquis Furcio for a long time. Van suddenly appeared before him, thanking him for accepting the job. Caught off guard, the adventurer admitted that exceptions among the nobility might exist. He decided to fight on the front lines, entrusting his life to Van. When Van hesitated, the man explained that he could not refuse a child willing to risk his own life. His companions agreed, noting that while they often mocked nobles, they had never met one who remembered all their names. Because of this, they chose to trust him. Dee and Espada committed as well. Protecting Van here meant protecting the future of the Marquis family. Still, Espada scolded Van, reminding him that as a lord, he needed to understand the weight of being an heir. The strategy was revised. Espada would maintain the barrier and handle long-range attacks. Dee would take the left flank. The adventurers would take the right. The battle began. The barrier rose, shimmering with layered magic. One adventurer marveled at the mage's power, while another remarked that had he refused, he would have willingly taken Espada's place. He even expressed a desire to see Van become king someday. The invaders fell quickly. Attacked from behind and unable to coordinate, panic spread. Dee's overwhelming presence caused many to flee outright. During the chaos, an enemy attempted to ambush the support group, nearly striking one of the women. Van reacted instantly, cutting the attacker's legs out from under him and finishing the fight with chilling calm. He warned the group to stay alert. By the end, all enemies were subdued and captured. Not a single casualty was suffered on Van's side. After receiving their reward, the adventurers discussed their future. Though the territory promised little immediate wealth, several decided to stay. One had a fixed job elsewhere, but the woman Van saved chose to remain. Others followed. They wanted to see what kind of person Van would become. Van was later scolded harshly by his maid, who demanded that if he ever risked his life again, he should use her as bait instead and never act so recklessly again. Entering the village, Van introduced himself as the new lord. The settlement was in terrible condition. The elderly village chief thanked them deeply and explained that the village had been attacked repeatedly that year. Since Count Ferdinand's time, night patrols had ceased. Van realized that under his father's rule, the village had nearly been abandoned. Van expressed regret, understanding that low taxes made the village a low priority. He declared that complaining was useless and instead proposed solutions. He outlined 3 measures: creating value so the kingdom could not ignore the village, ensuring steady income to hire mercenaries, and independently reforming and developing the settlement. When hope wavered, Espada revealed his status and Van's talent. Expectations soared. Van reduced taxes from 30% to 10%, earning cheers. Reconstruction began immediately. With earth magic and cooperation, the walls were reinforced. Van promised prosperity through unity. Testing his production magic, Van created an object so durable that even a sword could not damage it. That night, when asked about his limits, he admitted he could not sense any. The next day, he decided to build a house. Visualizing the structure, he activated his magic. In moments, a large house stood where none had before. And with it, the foundation of a future was laid. Although the structure is far more suitable for land management than typical elemental magic, making his skill truly intriguing, Van maintains that offensive magic remains superior for protecting people. He reasons that subjects would feel more secure under a lord who masters combat magic. However, Khamsin disagrees, asserting that he would rather live under Van's rule than Lord Jelpaz. He argues that while strength matters in war, people ultimately seek a ruler who improves their daily lives, a need that no one meets better than Van. Astounded that Van built an entire house alone, surpassing the capabilities of ordinary production magic, the villagers become excited. Van agrees to build houses for everyone provided they supply the timber. The village chief also requests new homes, noting that their current ones are collapsing due to harsh weather. Though Van initially finds the prospect of doing all the work at once exhausting, the sight of their miserable living conditions motivates him to radically renovate the village. Van constructs a whole new neighborhood in moments, replacing the old, dilapidated shacks. He explains his method involves pre-planning to avoid inequality. He makes all the houses identical for the time being, promising to customize them with stone once resources become available. Overwhelmed with gratitude, the villagers watch as Van also constructs a simple public bath next to his manor. Plural uses water magic to fill the tub, while Kamsin heats it with charcoal, creating a traditional Goemon-style bath. While Till and Plural enjoy the hot water, they praise Van's brilliance, recalling that even at age 2, his knowledge rivaled that of adults and he was a prodigy who consistently defeated soldier boys in swordsmanship. Meanwhile, Van and Kamsin bathe after a tiring day. Kamsin expresses his desire to become as strong as Dee to protect Van, just as Dee and his men join them in the bath. The next morning, thanks to the combined efforts of the knights and villagers, a great trench is completed around the village. To bolster defenses and secure a water source for drinking and bathing, they decide to turn it into a moat. Espada and his men begin diverting water from a nearby river, digging a trench dozens of meters long while Dee and Kamsin work manually. Van follows behind to reinforce the bottom and sides of the canal, despite the massive scale of the project. A shared goal makes the labor feel light, as they believe that improving conditions will attract merchants and lead to a peaceful future. Although Van estimates the work will take a week, the team works with such vigor that they finish much sooner. By the end of the day, everyone is exhausted except for Dee, who wishes to continue working as a form of training. The following morning, the connection to the river is finalized. Van thanks his men for their hard work over the past day and a half. As they open the gate and water flows into the moat, the village celebrates. Thinking ahead, Van worries about potential flooding during heavy rain and suggests creating a lake behind the village. Espada agrees, noting it could serve as a reservoir during droughts, and they decide to proceed with the plan. Talia marvels at the transformation, noting how the village went from lacking a waterway to having a reservoir lake. An old man expresses his gratitude to Van, relieved that they no longer have to trek to the river just to get water. Van reflects internally that he is glad water is now accessible to everyone, knowing life will become much easier for the entire village. Elsewhere, Panamera and Arte are shown playing and laughing together in their carriage. Panamera advises Arte to get some sleep, noting that the journey to the remote village is still long. The next morning, back at the village, Van is busy with further preparations. Talia observes that their defensive wall is now complete and much sturdier. Van reflects on his technique, noting that he experimented with mixing stones into the earthen wall to make it as strong as concrete. A young boy remarks that bandits won't be able to attack them anymore because of such a formidable barrier. Wanting to ensure even greater safety, Van crafts simple catapults and adds shields to the front so the villagers can fire arrows while remaining protected. Though the village is small, it begins to resemble a fortified city. Dee comments that it is no longer just a village, but a small fortress that bandits could never invade. He laments that if Lord Jelpa's new Van possessed this power, he would have made him the head of the family or a development consultant, as Van's clan is strong enough for combat, perhaps stronger than anyone else. Espada interrupts, chiding Dee for placing too much value on a leader's fighting ability alone, arguing that Van's power is best suited for protection rather than invasion. Van steps in to stop the bickering, stating that resenting their circumstances or talents won't help, and that they must make do with what they have. Later, Van enjoys a meal, deeply impressed by the food. Espada mentions that while protecting the village is vital, they must address its internal economy. He notes they have no connections except for traders who might visit once a month. Van suggests he can provide houses and furniture, and that the village crops are sufficient for food. However, Espada points out they lack spices and the ingredients for the baked sweets Van loves. Frustrated, Van urges the group to brainstorm something the village can sell. Kamsin suggests selling the wooden blocks Van creates or hunting monsters for resources, but Van rejects these ideas. Espada notes that finding something unique to sell from this village will be a challenge. The discussion shifts to weaponry when a young boy, who cherishes a wooden weapon Van made, is mentioned. When Van previously asked the men to test their weapons, they refused, not wanting to damage gifts from him. Van explained that while he was happy they cherished the items, they would not be able to protect themselves if they didn't learn to use them. He discussed a shield made from orcs that was sturdy yet flexible. To demonstrate, Camison struck it lightly, not wanting to break it, but the wooden sword shattered the shield anyway. The boy burst into tears, and everyone was shocked that a wooden weapon could cut with such sharpness. Suddenly, Ortho appears with minerals to sell. He explains that the deep forest at the foot of the Wolfsbrook Mountains is swarming with powerful monsters, which is why they find so many rare minerals without even entering the mountains. He presents iron ore, copper, silver, and even a bit of gold before revealing mithril ore. Ortho explains that mithril is usually only discovered during official surveys by the Knights of Honor due to its rarity. Van realizes that if these are found at the base, the mountains must be full of resources. Van takes the iron ore to use immediately. He experiments with it, noting that since he didn't melt it for purification, he isn't sure of its purity. He decides to make an iron shield for the boy and crafts a sword as well, telling his young customer that he paid extra attention to the decorations. Van uses his magic to craft a longsword, leaving everyone speechless. The adventurers immediately ask him to make swords for them as well. Van asks if his work is truly so well made that even professionals want one, and agrees to craft weapons for the adventurers for free since they provided the raw materials. Plural remarks that while they need to test the weapons to be sure, he believes Van could sell them for a very high price. Plural notes that he hasn't heard much about extracting minerals from forests instead of mountains unless there is a damas, a dungeon or monolith site nearby. Ortho asks if they think there is a damas here, to which Zara replies that no one knows for sure since the area hasn't been properly surveyed. Espada explains that discovering a damas would radically change their situation, as people and goods would flow into the village from everywhere. Van realizes the weight of this possibility. A new damas would cause the village's importance to skyrocket. Espada adds that these sites are national treasures filled with precious gems and resources, and typically, once the guild hears of a new one, they open a branch in the nearest town. However, Espada warns that while adventurers and merchants would come, the village currently lacks the food, infrastructure, and facilities to support them. Ortho suggests they should avoid looking for the damas for now. Plural questions if the Knights of Honor would be sent immediately if news got out, and suggests that Van must develop the village and achieve significant results before the discovery is public. This would make it harder for the Versio family to intervene, as they would otherwise profit more by reporting the discovery themselves. Later, while walking through the village with his maid, Van observes that they are doing well in terms of housing and declares that the temporary renovations are concluded. Suddenly, armored lizards are spotted approaching from the main road. Van immediately takes command, ordering the drawbridge raised and the gates closed. Addressing the frightened villagers, he acknowledges their fear of fighting and injury but emphasizes that everyone's life depends on this battle. He declares that while he will fight for them, he cannot protect everyone with his strength alone, asking them to lend him their strength so they can protect the village together. Motivated by Van's calm but resolute pep talk, the villagers swore to fight to their last breath to protect their home. Fear still lingered in their hearts, but it was now anchored by determination. Van immediately instructed everyone to move to the wall and take positions behind the ballistae, knowing that hesitation would only invite destruction. Compson soon informed Van that Ortho and his party were still out hunting. With the village's strongest fighters absent, a dangerous gap in leadership had formed. Van decided that he would go up to the wall with the villagers to personally oversee the defense. Before he could leave, however, Till grabbed his arm tightly. Tears streamed down her face as she begged him not to put himself in danger. Van hesitated. He didn't want to hurt her, but the situation was too urgent to delay. After a brief pause, he changed his plan. Instead of going himself, he ordered Dee to head up to the wall and relay everything he saw in real time. Van would remain on the ground, issuing commands and coordinating the defense. Dee accepted the order without hesitation and rushed toward the wall. The moment Dee reached the top, he froze. The sight before him was overwhelming. He quickly reported to Van that approximately 40 armored lizards were advancing toward the village. Each monster stood nearly 8 meters tall, massive enough to tower over houses and trees. Their heavy footsteps shook the ground, and their thick scales glimmered ominously. Panic crept into Dee's chest. He knew that even veteran knights would struggle to defeat a single armored lizard. Facing dozens of them with only a handful of trained fighters seemed impossible. Van's voice came through clearly. He ordered Dee to load the iron arrows into the giant crossbows. The knights immediately protested, insisting that ordinary weapons would never pierce scales tougher than steel. Dee silenced them. He was fully aware of the risk, but Van had proven himself time and time again. Trusting his instincts, Dee ordered everyone to load the ballistae and fire. The arrows vanished upon impact. For a brief moment, Dee thought the attack had failed. Then he realized the truth. The bolts hadn't bounced off, they had punched straight through. Wherever the iron arrows struck, massive holes tore through the lizards' bodies. Seconds later, the monsters collapsed, their enormous inertia carrying them forward before they finally hit the ground. In the first volley alone, 10 armored lizards were slain. Dee stared in awe. Not only were Van's weapons far more powerful than expected, but the villagers' aim was remarkably precise. He rallied them for a second round. The knights warned him that they had only one iron arrow left per ballista. Dee ordered them to fire anyway. More lizards fell, but when the dust settled, half the pack remained. Worse, they were completely out of iron ammunition. Dee relayed the grim news to Van. As the remaining lizards continued their advance, Van desperately searched for a solution. Then he remembered something crucial. Kamson's wooden sword had once cut through Fatty's high-spec shield. If that was possible, then perhaps. Van ordered Dee to switch to wooden arrows. The knights reacted with disbelief, calling the idea absurd. Wood could never penetrate hide tougher than steel. Dee shut them down immediately. Van had shattered their assumptions repeatedly, and Dee chose to trust him once more. He ordered the villagers to load the wooden arrows and fire. To everyone's shock, the wooden arrows pierced the lizards. Though the shafts embedded only halfway into the thick scales, they penetrated deeply enough to strike vital organs. One by one, the monsters collapsed instantly. Laughing in disbelief, Dee ordered another volley and declared that they would be feasting on lizard meat that night. Arrows rained down until the final armored lizard fell. Dee proudly announced their victory to Van. Cheers erupted across the village. Till hugged Van tightly, while Van stood stunned, struggling to comprehend that his wooden weapons had defeated monsters of such power. On the wall, the knights marveled that no one had been injured and that they still had plenty of ammunition left. Dee felt a slight disappointment the battle had ended too quickly, proving just how overwhelming Van's abilities were. Soon after, Ortho's party returned and began directing the processing of the lizard corpses. Eyes, fangs, skin, and magic cores were set aside for sale, while the meat was preserved. Ortho noted that armored lizards were usually difficult to process, often causing the meat to rot. Thanks to Van's knives, the work proceeded effortlessly. That night, the village held a massive celebration. Ortho's group praised Van's weapons, prompting Dee and the knights to demand swords of their own. Van refused payment but promised to craft them later. Later, Ortho explained that while armored lizards sold for 20 gold coins, spoilage would reduce profits. Even so, the earnings were massive. Espada then revealed the harsh truth. Half would be taken as tax by the Marquis. Devastated, Van agreed to report the victory to Mercia, crediting his elder brother instead. The next day, 2 merchants arrived, shocked by the fortress-like wall. Van greeted them atop the gate. Recognizing the Marquis's genius son, they introduced themselves as Bell and Rango of the Merry Chamber of Commerce. Once allowed inside the village, the merchant brothers were escorted to the warehouse. The moment they stepped inside, they froze in shock. Piled high were scales, claws, hides, and bones from armored lizards, quantities that seemed impossible for a small, nameless village to harvest. While the brothers struggled to process the sight, Van calmly asked if they were interested in buying the stock. The merchants agreed immediately, but requested a month to arrange a proper team and transportation. Van accepted without hesitation. He even offered them the lizard meat for free, explaining that without refrigeration, it would simply rot. Next, he displayed the weapons he had produced. The craftsmanship left the brothers speechless. The quality far exceeded their expectations, and they accepted Van's asking price without attempting to bargain. When Van asked them to help promote the weapons, the brothers hesitated, clearly hoping to monopolize the trade. Van noted that others would eventually discover the village anyway and proposed a different plan, establishing a permanent shop directly within the village. The brothers instantly saw the profit potential and agreed. Before they could fully process the agreement, Van used his magic to construct their dream shop right before their eyes, cementing a partnership. Shortly after, the village received 2 unexpected visitors, a noble girl and a formidable female knight. Around the same time, Espada gave Van new homework, instructing him to plan a city for 10,000 people, predicting the village would grow at an unprecedented pace. When asked for his vision, Van rejected standard square layouts. Instead, he proposed a star-shaped fortress designed to force attackers to waste time navigating multiple defensive choke points. Espada praised the tactical advantage of the design. Soon, a red-haired knight announced the visitors' arrival as emissaries from Ferdinando County. The knight introduced herself as Panamera, a viscountess who had risen by merit, while the nervous noble girl was Arte, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando. Panamera bluntly asked if Van understood their purpose. She explained that the Count feared Marquis Jalpa was using his genius son to prepare for an invasion. However, Panamera admitted she had a different theory, She suspected Van had been exiled for lacking elemental magic. Van confirmed this openly. He explained he had been kicked out with nothing but his luggage. Dee and Espada added that they had remained behind solely out of loyalty and admiration for Van's character. To settle the matter, Van decided to demonstrate his abilities. Outside, Espada raised a temporary earthen wall. Van then used production magic to process the mud into solid concrete and formed a sturdy wooden gate. Panamera and Arty were stunned. Van explained that production magic, considered the weakest form, was the reason for his exile. This revelation struck a chord with Arty, who seemed to recognize her own situation in his story. Panamera then moved to her second objective, formally offering Arty's hand in marriage. Van understood this as a political move to prevent conflict and declined, stating he desired only peace. Panamera admitted she had initially opposed the idea but had come to respect Van's character, jokingly adding she would marry him herself if she could. When asked directly, Arty shyly admitted she hadn't considered marriage yet. Van encouraged her to take her time. Realizing they needed a place to stay, Van promptly built an inn using his magic. During dinner, Van bonded with Arte over her love for cute things. Later, Panamera left them alone, and Arte quietly told Van he was a nice person before retreating to her room. Back at his mansion, Espada shared a realization. Since Arte was sent to a nameless village to marry, she likely lacked elemental magic as well. Understanding that Arte might be an exile just like him, Van resolved to let her stay in the village if she wished, regardless of whether marriage ever became part of their future. The following morning, Till and Kamsen hurriedly woke Van, insisting he accompany them to Lake Van, the body of water he had recently created. Van was dismayed to learn the villagers had named the lake after him, immediately resolving to stop them from naming the village similarly. Upon arrival, Dee and Espada revealed the source of the commotion, a rare mermaid hiding in the water. Espada noted how unusual this was, as mermaids typically inhabited deep, pristine forests to avoid human pollution. When the mermaid refused to respond to questions, Van devised a plan to lure her with food. He ordered Till and Kamsen to bring roasted meat. The scent drew her in, and after eating, she realized it was the meat of an armored lizard. She asked who had defeated the beasts, and the villagers unanimously credited Van. Seemingly satisfied with this answer, the mermaid vanished underwater, leaving Espada skeptical that such shy creatures would return. To everyone's surprise, the entire mermaid clan arrived at Van's door the next day. The intimidating Mermaid King stepped forward to thank Van for feeding his daughter and asked for confirmation regarding the armored lizard's defeat. Van tried to humbly credit the village's teamwork, but the mermaids were awestruck that a child had killed such powerful monsters. Suddenly, the king proclaimed Van a hero and offered his daughter, Lada, in marriage. Van was taken aback, pointing out that Lada was a mere child who couldn't possibly grasp the concept of marriage. He pressed the king for the true reason behind this offer. The king solemnly explained that armored lizards had recently invaded their territory, killing many of their kind. Desperate for safety, he was willing to marry his daughter to any hero capable of destroying their predators. Understanding the logic, Van assured the king that marriage was not necessary to ensure their safety. He told the king to let Lada marry whomever she chose when she grew up, promising to help the mermaids simply out of goodwill. Grateful, the Mermaid King asked if his people could reside in the lake. Van agreed and immediately constructed 2 floating rest houses in the center of the lake, making the mermaids feel instantly at home. When Espada reminded Van about the sewage issue, the curious king offered his assistance. After Van explained the village's architecture and the flush system used to manage waste, the king volunteered his people, who were skilled at water manipulation, to handle the job in exchange for a safe living space. Thanks to them, the work became significantly easier. Just then, Arty and her mommy, Panamera, arrived and were shocked to see the mermaids. The Mermaid King referred to Van as his son-in-law and thanked him, which shocked the human girls. Panamera asked Van if he had married a mermaid despite Arty being first in line. Before he could clear up the confusion, Lada proudly declared herself Van's wife. This escalated the tension between Van and Arty, so he invited Arty for a boating session the next day to clear the misunderstanding. On the boat, Arty revealed she had already heard the details from Panamera and was no longer confused. As she praised Van for building the lake and developing the village, Lada appeared, overcome with jealousy at seeing her husband with another girl. Other mermaid children surrounded the boat, chanting praises of Van as the meat lord while rocking the vessel. The motion caused Arty to accidentally fall onto Van. While the children stared in curiosity and Arty became nervous, Lada's jealousy peaked. She demanded to know what the strange girl was doing with her husband. Van reminded her that he had turned down her father's offer, so they were not even engaged. Lada pouted and went underwater, prompting the other mermaid children to yell at Van for bullying their princess. They proceeded to rock the boat violently, Arty clung to Van, who tried unsuccessfully to bribe the kids with meat. Later, the Mermaid King confronted Van. He stated that he had heard from Lada that Van was flirting with another woman despite being married. Although Arte was terrified by the king's stern expression, Van firmly clarified that he had never agreed to marry Lada. Unwilling to listen to logic, the king declared a competition between the merfolk and Van's people. If the merfolk won, Van would officially recognize the marriage. Van intended to refuse, but Dee suddenly accepted the challenge on his behalf, promising victory as the deputy commander of the Knights Order. Espada agreed, arguing that settling the issue quickly would give Van more time for his studies, and Panamera concurred. Although Van protested that losing would result in a forced marriage, Till and Kamsin assured him that defeat was impossible. Unable to stop his friend's blind faith in him, Van reluctantly agreed. The Mermaid King proposed a 3-event competition to ensure fairness, allowing Van to pick the first event. Instead of choosing an event where he held a clear advantage, Van selected water polo, reasoning it would be equally difficult for both sides as no one knew how to play. After creating a pool within the pond and explaining the rules, Van was praised by Till for his obscure knowledge. Panamera noted that the swimsuits Van made were garnering attention. While Dee showed off his physique, Van asked Panamera if she would participate. She affirmed that she needed him to marry Arty, not the princess, and would do whatever it took to protect him. The game began with Panamera and Till representing Van's village against Lada and her father. The Mermaid King immediately scored a service ace, and the mermaids began overwhelming the humans. By halftime, the point difference was massive, and Till began to lose hope. However, Panamera, furious at his resignation, asked if his loyalty to Van was so fragile. Her words fired Till up, and together they began closing the gap in the second half. At match point, everything hung on the final play. Panamera jumped to block the Mermaid King's spike, but he got past her, and Till failed to defend. The mermaids won the first round. Van was unhappy to see Panamera acting hopeful despite the loss. The Mermaid King then proposed the second event, a swimming relay race. Van realized the impossibility of beating mermaids in water, but Dee insisted it would be barely an inconvenience, and Kamsin volunteered to join him. The race began with Lada and Kamsin. As expected, Lada took a comfortable lead, swimming underwater to travel faster. Kamsin struggled to keep up but managed to tag Dee. Dee immediately utilized the butterfly stroke, which the knights explained allowed him to use his full muscular strength. He rushed forward like a motorboat, overtaking the mermaid and winning the race. The Mermaid King was in disbelief, while Dee walked out of the pond proudly, unaware that the water pressure from his speed had torn off his swimwear. Still unable to digest the defeat, the Mermaid King asked Van to pick the third and final game. Van devised an idea that would be fair for both sides, a shave ice eating contest. He created an ice shaving machine and asked Pluriel to create ice, which he then flavored with syrup. Van announced that he would participate himself, and Arty shocked everyone by volunteering as his partner. The 4 participants sat with huge bowls of shaved ice. Panamera whispered to Arty that it wasn't too late to switch, but Arty refused to stop fighting for her future husband. Upon Espada's signal, everyone began consuming the ice. Immediately, they were all struck by intense brain freeze. Determined to secure the marriage, the Mermaid King powered through the pain, with Lada following his lead. Van feared they would lose, but Arty overcame her brain freeze and began eating steadily, 1 spoon at a time. Her resilience gave Van the courage to rejoin the fray. After an intense struggle, Van and Arte finished their bowls first, winning the competition. The Mermaid King gracefully accepted defeat, and Van was relieved that the pressure to marry Lada was gone. However, the king still referred to him as his son-in-law, stating that Van had proven himself even more worthy of his daughter before departing. Perplexed, Van wondered what the point of the competition had been. Suddenly, his stomach began to hurt from the excessive ice, and his friends gathered around to check on him. Watching from the side, Panamera told Arty she had done a good job, but Arty could only watch Van surrounded by his loyal friends, wondering how she could ever enjoy that kind of attention. She reflected on her past, neglected since birth by a workaholic father and a mother who abandoned her to backpack across Europe. Arty had grown up lonely, timid, and perceived as unintelligent. Her only talent was marionette magic, which she had hoped would impress her mother. Instead, her mother had slapped her, deeming the magic evil in the hands of nobles, and abandoned her completely. At age 10, she was sent to marry the lord of a nameless village. She had been worried, but Van turned out to be kind. Despite having what was considered a useless type of magic, he remained confident and beloved. Inspired by seeing him now, Arte decided to practice her puppetry magic relentlessly, so that one day, she too would be loved for it. The next day, Van gathered the villagers for construction work, hyping them up with the promise of a barbecue party that night. Arty approached him to greet him, asking if she could observe his work, as she wished to become more like him. The narrative shifts to Van, who stands before the newly expanded city walls of Panamera, filled with a profound sense of satisfaction. His eyes sweep over the reinforced towers, noting the undeniable progress from the settlement's humble beginnings. The residents murmur with admiration at the speed of the transformation, while the girl Panamera cannot hide her astonishment at Van's constant ability to surprise her. Van explains that a strong city must always look toward the future. To accommodate the influx of resilient merchants and adventurers drawn to the strategic hub, he has commissioned new housing. Panamera listens with admiration, her own dream being to one day build a true empire. However, her focus shifts to a massive structure looming before them. Van identifies it as a ballista, a siege engine he has significantly modified. He explains that he redesigned the mechanism to launch 2 projectiles simultaneously, vastly increasing its destructive output. They decide to test the weapon. The ballista fires with a deafening roar, the twin bolts tearing through the air and obliterating part of a nearby mountain. As the dust settles, a stunned silence falls over the group. The power exceeds even Van's expectations. Panamera immediately attempts to buy the weapon. When Van refuses, she reminds him that he owes her a favor. Van agrees to gift her 1 ballista, but on the condition that she will owe him a return favor in the future. Confident in her abilities, she accepts. They briefly discuss logistics, arranging for a reinforced carriage to transport the heavy weapon and speculating on methods to mass-produce the iron bolts. During this exchange, a knight suggests Panamera acquire a sword from Van. She refuses, claiming her current blades are superior. To prove a point, Van takes one of her swords and shears through it with his own blade as if cutting a dry twig. He reveals his sword is merely ordinary iron, leaving Panamera shocked. When he confirms the ballista is made of the same refined material capable of piercing multiple armored lizards at once, she promptly orders extra ammunition to reinforce her own defenses. Their tranquility is shattered by shouting adventurers fleeing toward the city. Behind them, a forest dragon tears through the sky, its wings creating a thunderous echo. Van immediately shifts gears, intending to buy time for the civilians to evacuate. Panamera, eager to repay the favor of the ballista, steps up to assist. Van apologizes for the danger, noting that this beast is far deadlier than anything they have faced before. He orders his maid to summon reinforcements, including D, while he and Panamera hold the line. The dragon's presence instills primal fear in the defenders. As it swoops down, Panamera scales the wall with incredible agility. She delivers a massive strike that nearly grounds the beast, but the dragon is resilient. Though wounded and bleeding, it continues to rise, ignoring the pain. Van realizes their previous victories against lesser monsters may have made them overconfident. This is a threat on a completely different level. Van orders the ballistas to fire. The bolts streak across the sky, damaging the dragon's wings, but the creature skillfully dodges the fatal blows. On the ground, the battle becomes desperate. Panamera misses a strike, then lands a second, terrifying blow, yet the dragon persists. Suddenly, Espada enters the fray. Ignoring Van's order to retreat, he executes a heavy stone strike to delay the monster. The attack leaves Espada immobilized, with only one ally standing by his side as the others pull back. Seeing the creature approach the wall, Panamera prepares to advance again. Van stops her, asking if she can repay her favor to him right now. He quickly outlines a desperate plan. When the dragon reaches the wall, Panamera must use her magic to paralyze it completely. This will create the perfect, stationary opening they need to end the fight with a devastating barrage of ballista fire. Reinforcements arrive in the form of D and his companions, but they are initially thrown back by the dragon's overwhelming power. Espada steps in, using his ability to buy a few precious seconds for the others to retreat. Seeing the opening, Van signals Panamera. She executes her strike immediately, her magic paralyzing the dragon at the critical moment. Van shouts the order, and the ballistas fire in a near simultaneous volley. By a narrow margin, the heavy bolts pierce the beast's defenses, bringing the forest dragon crashing down. D rushes in to finish the fight. He narrowly dodges a final, desperate snap of the dragon's jaws before countering with precision. The creature collapses, raising a massive cloud of dust as the battle ends. Panamera approaches Van, congratulating him on leading the defense against such a catastrophe. Van hesitates to take credit, but she argues that an ordinary village would have been annihilated. She points out the rarity of allies like Espada and D, and the terrifying efficiency of the ballistas that pierce dragon scales. Van, ever the perfectionist, merely grumbles that he wants the weapons to fire 10 consecutive times without failure. Panamera dismisses his technical fretting. All that matters is the victory. She urges him to announce the triumph immediately. At the guild, Van declares the defeat of the forest dragon, the Lord of the Forest. Panamera emphasizes the miracle that a small village defeated such a threat without a single fatality. The city celebrates the beginning of a new era. Honors are distributed to the key players. D is officially recognized as a dragon slayer. Espada receives a title for his tactical mastery. His magic was essential in containing the monster to create openings for the others. Finally, Van is named. Despite being only 8 years old, his quick reasoning, unprecedented construction magic, and ability to organize a defense against a legendary beast earn him the title Lord of the Two Lands. It is a designation carrying significant political weight. As the celebrations continue, the narrative shifts to Panamera's internal thoughts. Having risen from knighthood to nobility, she has known ambitious soldiers and proud nobles, yet she has never met anyone like Van. He possesses a confusing mix of genius, boldness, and a visionary eye for the future. Panamera's own path was forged in fire. Born in the capital to a traditional family of knights, she was raised on strict discipline. When her magical aptitude appeared, she was sent to train under a count renowned for refining talent. The training was brutal, demanding physical endurance and tactical mastery that broke most students. Panamera persevered, refusing mediocrity. She rose to become a platoon leader and eventually a commander. Her military successes were so undeniable that Her Majesty granted her the title of Viscountess, a rare achievement for a young woman who earned her rank through merit rather than inheritance. Panamera reveals she was originally in the region on orders from Count Ferdinand. The mission was to oversee the security and negotiation of a marriage between the Count's youngest daughter and a local lord to strengthen alliances. However, upon arrival, the prospective bride became interested in Van instead. Accustomed to evaluating political landscapes, Panamera realized Van was not just a talented boy but a convergence point for power. While the regional marquis had offered no aid, Van had strengthened his city and slain a dragon. Panamera decides to pivot. She proposes an alliance to Van. If the village comes under her official protection, Count Ferdinand's knights will pose no threat. Furthermore, the alliance would create an axis of military and commercial cooperation, accelerating the city's development. Van listens, quickly grasping the strategic value. Reducing enemies and gaining powerful allies is a basic principle of survival. Recognizing this as a unique opportunity to consolidate what he has built, Van accepts. The deal is struck, marking the end of the battle and the beginning of a promising political future for the territory. The day after their victory against the wild dragon, Van and Esparta discuss the village's future. Since Van's newly built fortress walls successfully served their purpose during the battle, Esparta suggests shifting focus to broader village planning. He envisions a bustling city capable of housing 10,000 people. Van agrees, and they decide their first step is attracting new residents to transition the remote village into a true city. Their planning is quickly interrupted when Till enters to announce the arrival of the merchant brothers, Bell and Rango, along with senior merchants from their company. Excited, Van postpones city planning to sell the harvested forest dragon materials. In the warehouse, the brothers explain that a large forest dragon is incredibly rare. Because its scales, claws, and eyes are in pristine condition, they estimate the parts could easily fetch 100 platinum coins, a fortune capable of making someone a millionaire in the real world. Meanwhile, the senior merchants carefully examine the carcass and quietly plot their strategy. When Van asks for their professional assessment, the veterans enthusiastically rub their hands together, claiming he won't find better partners. They promise their highest price available, a mere 60 platinum coins. Realizing this offer is drastically lower than the brothers' earlier estimate, Van decides to consult Bell and Rango again. This panics the senior merchants, who fear the inexperienced brothers will ruin their scam. They corner Bell and Rango, demanding they play along to maximize profits from what they perceive as a clueless child. The brothers refuse, arguing that honest merchants must provide fair value. The veterans scoff, confident Van has no other choice in such a remote location. Overhearing everything, Van is about to intervene when Bell and Rango proudly declare their commitment to honesty, believing it yields greater long-term returns. Furious, the veterans curse the novices and threaten to expel them from the prestigious Merry Chamber of Commerce. After the veterans storm off, the brothers admit they will likely be fired, as higher-ups usually side with seniority. Van casually suggests they start their own trading company. Thoroughly shocked, they explain the immense difficulty. It requires paying a merchant guild registration fee, acquiring a shop, and the hardest part, securing a formal endorsement from a titled noble. Knowing only one titled noble, Van immediately asks Panamera for the endorsement. She agrees without a second thought. When Van warns her that the Merry Chamber is backed by the royal family, Panamera brushes it off. She doubts a gigantic company will care about a minor noble supporting a two-man enterprise, and she welcomes the positive reputation of helping honest merchants establish themselves. Seizing a chance for favorable publicity, Van suggests Panamera take credit for slaying the dragon. This would conveniently keep Van's family from discovering his involvement. Panamera rejects the idea, explaining that slaying a dragon triggers independent investigations that would inevitably trace back to Van and Dee anyway. Devastated, Van fears his family will summon him and seize control of the village. Panamera advises that the only way to protect his claim is to acquire his own noble title. As a Marquis' son, he could easily obtain a baron title directly from the king, but only if he claims the glory of the dragon kill. Van panics, wanting no part of the clout. Panamera insists it's his only option, sympathetically recalling how she incinerated her own enemies to assert dominance. She encourages Van to ruthlessly fire his ballistae at anyone who challenges him. Unsure what to do with this highly illegal advice, Van asks if she needs the glory herself. She fiercely replies she doesn't need a child worrying about her career. Van returns to Belle and Rango with news of Panamera's backing. Overjoyed that they can open their own company, the brothers purchase the dragon parts for a generous 130 platinum coins and prepare for the capital. However, the greedy senior merchants have stolen all the carriages. Undeterred, Van uses his magic to build them a brand new carriage, and Panamera lends them her exceptionally powerful war horses to ensure a swift journey. Meanwhile, on the road, the greedy senior merchants laugh amongst themselves, assuming the brothers will soon come crawling back without transportation. Their amusement shatters when Panamera suddenly overtakes them in a newly built carriage. The veterans quickly realize the brothers are successfully forming their own company with a noble's backing. Soon after, Panamera reaches the royal capital and requests an audience with King Dino. When the king asks if she is seeking another promotion, Panamera clarifies she wants a noble title for a friend. Intrigued, King Dino asks why this friend isn't present. Panamera explains he is busy protecting a faraway village but has already achieved magnificent things. She reveals the person is 8-year-old Van, the youngest son of Marquis Ferdio, and states he single-handedly defeated a forest dragon. This declaration sends the court into a frenzy. The king assumes Van must be a powerful elemental mage, but Panamera clarifies the boy possesses production magic. She recounts Van's astonishing exploits, explaining how he defeated bandits alongside a small group before using his magic to transform a rundown settlement into a stronghold. Finding the story difficult to believe, King Dino is finally convinced when Panamera presents a dragon fang as undeniable proof. She invites the king to visit the village, confident the fortress will secure Van's promotion. The king agrees and officially grants Van the title of baron. Panamera publicly announces the decision, eager to stir up gossip and see how interesting things become. Back in the village, Van is completely unaware of his new title. He remodels existing houses and builds several new ones to increase capacity, along with 2 tall watchtowers to serve as a symbol of their growing civilization. While enjoying lunch atop a tower, Esparta suggests renaming the settlement Vantown. Though Van is annoyed and doesn't want his name used as a brand, everyone else enthusiastically agrees. They celebrate the progress with cake baked by Till, using fresh ingredients from Belle and Rango's newly established shop. Their peaceful afternoon breaks when they notice a group of people at the town gate. Van investigates and finds dirty, starving individuals searching for Seto Village, the settlement's unofficial original name. The refugees explain they fled a neighboring village in Ferdinand County. Their local lord conscripted all the young people into his army, leaving them with a depleted workforce and crippling taxes. Hearing rumors of miraculous changes in Van's territory, they came seeking relief. Though Van realizes accepting refugees from Ferdinand County is politically risky, he cannot abandon desperate people. He takes them in, offering them citizenship. When the tearful leader admits they cannot pay taxes, Van promises them temporary tax relief, warm houses, and plenty of food, leaving the villagers feeling they have found heaven on earth. Learning that 300 more people remain at their original settlement, Van offers to dispatch adventurers to safely escort them. The deeply emotional leader asks how they can ever repay this kindness. Van humbly brushes it off, promising to send carriages for their belongings. However, the leader notes they already have 10 cows to transport their luggage. This thrills Van, as the cattle will allow him to finally start a dairy and enjoy milk products. Ortho and his party of adventurers are immediately dispatched to escort the remaining villagers. Though some adventurers question the logic of Van's charity, their green-haired companion tells them to focus on the task. The group comforts the relocating villagers, and Ortho reassures a doubtful, exhausted woman that their destination is nothing short of paradise. Upon arriving at Vantown, the disheartened refugees are greeted by a massive barbecue. Disbelieving the high quality of the food, the starving people eat with tears of joy. Afterward, they approach Van to ask for work, fearing expulsion if they don't contribute. Van outlines his plans, explaining they can work in agriculture and run his new stores. When they worry about lacking business knowledge, Van eases their fears, telling them to leave administrative tasks to educated personnel. The former village chief arrives to warmly welcome the guests, praising Van for improving their standard of living. Overwhelmed by the unprecedented hospitality, the refugees are treated to one final surprise: cakes prepared by Van using milk from their own cows. He promises their lives will only improve as Vantown becomes a full-fledged city. For the first time, the refugees finally feel they can truly live, rather than just survive. The day's grueling labor had finally concluded, leaving everyone yearning for a warm meal and immediate rest. Yet, when evening studies were announced, Van immediately protested. Crossing his arms indignantly, he argued that after all they had accomplished since dawn, studying was simply asking too much. In return, he received a dry, almost automatic reply: "No one has ever died from studying." Before the argument could escalate, grave news interrupted them. During a nearby hunt, a dungeon entrance had been discovered. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Uncovering a dungeon required notifying the royal capital without delay, which would inevitably draw swarms of adventurers lured by treasure and fame. Worse, this influx carried the risk that Van's father might learn of the village's secret expansion plans. Despite these dangers, ignoring the situation would only invite disaster. The group made a swift decision. An envoy must travel to the capital to deliver the official report. Kusara volunteered without hesitation. Armed with the necessary documents, received a modest mithril reward, and immediately began her journey back. Navigating an isolated stretch of road on her return, Kusara encountered a lone woman ambushed by bandits. The thugs were no match for her combat prowess, and the skirmish ended swiftly. Catching her breath, the rescued stranger introduced herself as Flammaria. She explained that after losing her father in the war and having her home seized, she was traveling to the capital to seek work as a maid out of desperation. Rather than offering empty sympathy, Kusara presented a practical alternative: return with her to the village. Kusara explained that with the newly discovered dungeon, the settlement was rapidly expanding. The resulting boom in commerce and jobs would provide Flammaria with a much safer livelihood. Relieved, Flammaria accepted the offer. Back in the village, expansion plans advanced at an accelerated pace. Anticipating that the dungeon would inevitably attract merchants, blacksmiths, and opportunistic onlookers, a groundbreaking strategy emerged. They would build a small city around the existing village, specifically designed as a bustling adventurer hub. To maintain order, they would need a dedicated magistrate and a new order of knights separate from the main village's guards. The proposal materialized quickly. Recruits were trained, administrative roles defined, and defensive walls began to rise around the perimeter. Van assumed the role of construction coordinator, displaying a level of focus highly unusual for his age. Materials arrived in a continuous stream of carts rattling in and out throughout the day, driving toward a staggering goal: laying the new city's foundation within a single month. However, news of the dungeon spread faster than their stone walls could rise. Individuals seeking easy fortunes began pouring in before construction was finished. While some were seasoned adventurers, others were transparent opportunists, hiding calculating intentions. Kusara arrived amidst this chaotic influx, officially introducing Flammaria to the group. Van welcomed them both warmly, dispensing with unnecessary formalities to get straight to work. Troublemakers soon congregated near the dungeon's entrance. As it turned out, they were good people, worried about the group's safety. When the swelling crowd of newcomers loudly questioned how a remote village had managed to erect such massive walls so quickly, Van answered with a live demonstration. Stepping before the crowd, he channeled his magic to summon a temporary structure. The crowd fell silent, their doubt instantly replaced by absolute shock and a newfound respect. Not everyone was won over. An arrogant visiting noble stepped forward to belittle Van, criticizing his youth and loudly insinuating that a mere child had no right commanding a project of such scale. The atmosphere grew dangerously heated when a knight commander loyal to the noble threatened formal punitive measures against the village. Despite this tense standoff, the daily dynamics shifted in curious ways. The local Mohawk sporting delinquents, who had previously been a constant nuisance, now greeted Van with respectful bows. Van accepted their fealty, but made it perfectly clear that future misbehavior would be severely punished. Through it all, the young lord genuinely enjoyed commanding the operation with unshakable confidence. Even when rumors circulated that he had been exiled from his own noble house, Van responded with fierce pride, declaring that he remained a lord of his own lands, whether the world liked it or not. The village bustled with frenetic energy as scouting groups returned from the dungeon with detailed reports of lethal monsters and intricate traps. The explorers warned that reaching the dungeon was perilous. It sat near a sheer cliff, 2 hours away, surrounded by unstable terrain. Van listened intently to every detail. After calmly evaluating the logistical nightmare, he made a ruthlessly practical decision. If the primary problem was a lack of infrastructure, they would simply build it. The following day, the group sets out toward the dungeon's entrance. Upon arriving at an improvised log, serving as a crude passage over the deep cliff, Van immediately orders everyone to stop. He calmly explains that a single, minor mistake would be enough to cost someone their life. Even an agile adventurer could fall if the rotting wood gave way or a strong wind blew. Merely being careful or relying on luck is insufficient, so the only correct solution is to eliminate the risk entirely. Without hesitation, Van decides they will build a real bridge. First, he installs a reinforced, thick, and towering gate, solid enough to prevent any monsters from escaping the dungeon unchecked. The gate is not symbolic, it is practical, highly resistant, and designed to withstand real impacts. Without pausing to rest, Van uses his magic to raise an entire 3-story building right beside the dungeon entrance, intended to support the adventurers who will frequently explore the location. The sheer scale and quality of the structure impress even the most experienced veterans. The first floor serves as a wide rest area, spacious enough to accommodate several groups simultaneously. The second floor houses a spacious dining hall prepared to handle large crowds without descending into disorder. The third floor contains comfortable rooms organized practically but with a keen attention to detail. The windows offer scenic views of the surrounding landscape, and a small terrace allows guests to breathe fresh air, far removed from the tension of the dungeon entrance. To complete the facility, Van adds a reservoir on the roof to collect rainwater. He explicitly explains to the crowd that this water is meant strictly for cleaning, washing equipment, and general tasks, and that it is not drinkable without proper treatment. Even after making this clear, he notices from the exchanged glances that not everyone has fully grasped the distinction. With the facility practically ready and fully functional, Van hands the administration of the base over to Ortho, entrusting him to organize the flow of adventurers and manage the resources. Van firmly reinforces his rules, leaving no room for debate. Safety comes before any reckless adventurer bravado. Van looks toward the horizon and decides it is time to return to the village. Despite leading gigantic construction projects and making high-level strategic decisions, he is ultimately still a child bound by a strict curfew. Trying to lighten the mood, he jokes that if he stays past his allowed time, he might end up destroying the base himself just to avoid getting scolded. The group laughs, knowing full well that he is half serious about the severe reprimand awaiting him. Just then, Arty notices something unusual on the ground near the newly erected area. Upon closer examination, the group confirms what it is: authentic mithril ore. Van crouches down to personally check and carefully analyze the material. The find is absolutely enormous. For a few moments, pure excitement takes over the group, as such a rare resource will not only increase the value of the dungeon but also completely change the strategic value of the entire region. However, the triumphant mood fades the moment Van arrives back at the village. He immediately notices Esparta waiting for him with a furious, unfriendly expression. Esparta demands that the boy come inside immediately so they can talk. Panicking, Van begins asking all of his friends for help, but no one is willing to face Esparta's famous fury. Desperate, Van clings to Ortho, hoping that as an experienced adventurer, he might be able to intervene. Ortho attempts to step in and help the boy, but Esparta sharply tells him to stay quiet. Without another word, Esparta grabs Van by the shoulder and marches him home. The next day, Van and Arty went for a walk through the town together. During their stroll, Van realized that Arty had been in the village for quite some time and asked if she planned to stay permanently. When Arty hesitated, Van assumed she was still worried about her previous engagement expectations. He advised her to forget about outside pressures and focus entirely on what she truly wanted. Blushing, Arty admitted that her true desire was to be engaged to him. Van blushed as well. He was clearly happy to hear this, though he tried his best not to show too much excitement. Later on, Bell and Rango returned from the royal capital. They had successfully established their trading company and thanked Van, acknowledging that they could only have accomplished this with his support. They then handed over the agreed payment of 30 platinum coins. Van was very grateful and passed the money to Till. Upon holding the coins, Till was left completely speechless, as it was the first time she had ever handled such a massive amount of money. Shortly after, Compson mentioned that Panamera would not be returning to the village immediately because she had business to handle in the Ferdinando Count territory. However, Bell and Rango clarified that Panamera believed forming an alliance with Van would be better than remaining under the Count, meaning she would likely be around more often. Initially shocked, Van assumed Panamera planned to live in their village permanently. They clarified that she would not live inside the village itself, but would instead be given land nearby. Knowing Panamera was the type of person who always got what she wanted, Van realized it was only a matter of time before this happened. Bell and Rango then presented Van with a masterpiece they had purchased in the royal capital. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary box, but upon opening it, the box transformed into a mechanical crossbow. The device was the newest technology available, capable of firing up to 10 shots in a row. Bell and Rango believed Van could use it to create new ballistae. Excited by the possibilities, Van immediately replicated the mechanical crossbow using one of his blocks. However, upon testing it, he realized he had not recreated it perfectly. Seeing this, Arty understood that even someone as capable as Van was not flawless. Van laughed lightly, admitting that he failed at many things outside of his production magic and considered himself truly good at very little. This surprised Arty, who had always thought Van could do everything perfectly. Van then asked Arty about her magical aptitude. Feeling insecure, she hesitated to answer. Till noticed her discomfort and gently reassured her that she did not have to respond if she didn't want to, noting that Van would never force her. Arty decided it was fine and finally revealed that she had an aptitude for marionette magic. Van understood her hesitation immediately. Marionette magic was often rejected and looked down upon. Having never seen it in action, Van asked her to demonstrate. He created a block puppet for her to use, and Arty seamlessly used her magic to move the puppet around as though it were alive. Completely surprised and seeing the immense potential in her power, Van embraced her. Till, recognizing Arte's graceful skill, suggested organizing a small puppet show for the villagers. She believed everyone would enjoy it and suggested Van could create a puppet using the mithril ore Arty had found the other day. Still hesitant, Arty argued her magic was not meant to impress others. Van gently explained that he had once felt the same way, sharing how his father had called him a failure for having production magic. Yet, it was that same magic that allowed him to help the village and bring happiness to the people. This revelation shifted Arty's perspective. Having always seen herself as useless, she realized that if Van could overcome his doubts to succeed, she could too. For the first time, she felt a spark of belief in herself. Later that night, the villagers gathered in the town square, whispering in confusion about why they had been summoned. Van stepped forward and announced that Arte was going to perform a show. A human-sized puppet was brought out. Taking a deep breath, Arty used her magic to slowly make the puppet bow. The villagers immediately recognized the highly stigmatized marionette magic, with some recalling that it had historically been used in an attempt to attack the royal family. As murmurs spread through the crowd, Arty felt judged, exposed, and deeply self-conscious. She briefly considered running away, but after noticing Van's concerned expression, she steadied herself. Gathering her courage, she gracefully guided the puppet through a dance. The lifeless figure moved beautifully, as if it had a soul of its own, leaving the crowd in complete silence. Van was reminded of the incredible power of marionette magic to breathe life into inanimate objects. When the dance ended, Arty braced herself for harsh words and rejection. Instead, the villagers erupted into loud cheers, demanding an encore. Van walked up to congratulate her, and her long-held fears finally melted away. Overcome with emotion, she ran into his arms, thanking him for helping her discover the strength she had always carried inside. The next day, Panamera returned from the royal palace. After speaking with Arty, she was surprised by the girl's newfound confidence and realized Van had been a positive influence. When asked what trick he used, Van simply explained that Arty had never lacked talent, only confidence. Impressed, Panamera then shifted to the reason for her visit. King Dino Scuderia and his chancellor, Aperta, had arrived. Van knelt without hesitation. King Dino officially granted Van the title of Baron, welcoming him into the lower ranks of the nobility and advising him to serve the nation faithfully. The king mentioned he would send someone to investigate a newly discovered dungeon in the area and requested an honest explanation of how the village had defeated a forest dragon. Van agreed but asked the king to keep an open mind, warning that the truth might sound unbelievable. Van began by explaining the village's offensive and defensive weapons. Aperta examined the equipment closely, focusing especially on the ballistae. He noted that while they were good for long-range attacks, they were not convenient for daily use. Disagreeing, Van ordered Kamson to fire a shot, demonstrating the weapon's shocking destructive power. King Dino was astounded, and his disbelief grew upon learning that Van had designed and created all the materials alone. Anticipating their skepticism, Van explained that the massive village ramparts had been built in no more than 4 months, leaving both royal guests stunned. During a tour of the village, the locals' warm greetings proved Van's strong leadership. The king was further shocked to see a river filled with extremely rare palu. As the tour continued, Esparta demonstrated creating a strong foundation using earth magic, which Van then transformed into a solid rampart using his production magic. The display left Dino and Aperta completely speechless. Later, Vesta arrived to pay his respects to the king, offering a piece of orichalcum as a token of friendship. Knowing this metal of the gods could be forged into a sword worth hundreds of platinum coins, Van instinctively used his magic to craft a sword on the spot. He quickly hid it behind his back to conceal his effortless ability, but Panamera urged him to tell the truth. Respecting Van's honesty, the king offered to pay any price for the sword. However, Van declined money. Instead, he requested a guarantee of permanent residence in the village, asking never to be relocated. Understanding the request but reluctant to waste Van's talents, Dino agreed on the condition that Van would cooperate if the royal capital sent an emissary. Touched by Van's devotion to his village, the king granted the wish, bringing Van one step closer to his desired quiet life. Just as Dino prepared to return to the capital, villagers began screaming in panic. A dragon was rapidly approaching the village. Van quickly ordered everyone to man the defenses and prepare the adventurers. With Panamera agreeing to help, Van felt confident they could handle the situation. The dragon flew toward them dramatically, leaving everyone staring at the sky, wondering what their next move should be. The king questioned whether the recent attacks could be the work of the kingdom of Yelanetta, a possibility the prime minister considered quite high. Turning to the young boy, Van, the king explained that their true enemy extended beyond the wyvern. Because there was a strong chance that a small group of experienced knights was also involved, the king urged the boy to exercise extreme caution. Observing the situation, Van noted that the distance was too great for the ballista's arrows to reach their target. Realizing there was no other solution, he concluded that it would be necessary to test an unused prototype. Meanwhile, a group of people traversed a dense forest, noting that the wyvern had already begun scouting the skies above the village of Cedo. Unimog, the 8th prince of the kingdom of Yelanetta, expressed great satisfaction at personally leading the invasion of such a distant settlement. One of his guards clarified that due to the mission's paramount importance, the king had specifically entrusted this task to the prince. The kingdom of Yelanetta harbored a long-standing rivalry with the neighboring kingdom of Scuderia, and they believed the time had finally arrived to settle old scores. Prince Unimog confidently asserted that conquering such a remote village would pose no problem. As the group carefully observed the road, they realized they were nearing their destination. Upon finally catching sight of the location, everyone was astonished to find a fully structured, fortified base. While some wondered how such a formidable structure could be built in isolation, the prince commanded silence. He reasoned that constructing a true fortified city was incredibly difficult, leading him to believe the defenders had merely built a facade to create a false impression. Disregarding a subordinate's plea for caution and demanding strict obedience, the prince ordered his forces to advance and seize the territory. However, upon initiating the attack, the invaders were shocked to find themselves entirely unable to breach the wall. As the prince stood in disbelief, Van appeared. When Van inquired why they were attacking the village, one of the men demanded to know how Van had discovered their affiliation with Yelanetta. Van revealed that his question had merely been a test, which they had inadvertently confirmed. Frightened by the inexplicable presence of such massive walls in a small village, the prince demanded to know the construction methods used. Van simply stated that he and the villagers had built it together. Refusing to be mocked by a child, the prince ordered his men to signal the mage to attack, despite a warrior's warning that the strike might hit their own dragon. Seizing the moment, Van instructed Panamera to launch a counterattack. Summoning a massive barrage of shurikens, she swiftly defeated the dragon, leaving the enemy forces in absolute awe of her strength. Van noted that this was the first successful use of the technique, which he deemed a threat comparable to the 4 elemental magics. Carefully observing the ensuing situation, the prince suddenly realized that the king of Scuderia himself was present. Stunned by the monarch's presence in such a remote village, the prince lost his resolve. When Van challenged them to continue fighting, the enemy knights surrendered. The king, deeply impressed by the young man, reflected on rumors of Van's expulsion from his home and realized that no one had truly understood the boy's actual potential. He resolved to review the kingdom's studies on magical aptitude upon his return to the royal capital. During a subsequent interrogation, the captives were pressed to reveal their kingdom's overarching plan. After Panamera threatened to tear out his eyes, the terrified prince confessed everything. He explained that the kingdom of Yelanetta had spent years preparing for this invasion. The initial phase involved attacking the isolated village within the Marquis territory, assuming it would be an easy conquest, a revelation that prompted Panamera to laugh at their spectacular failure. When asked about other targets, the prince disclosed that another military force was simultaneously attacking the main fortified city of Scudit. Realizing the gravity of the situation, the group acknowledged the urgent need to return to the royal capital, organize the Knight Order, and depart immediately to defend Scudit. The king agreed but requested Van's participation in the city's defense. Although Van recognized the honor, he hesitated, fearing that leaving his developing village, which he felt was only at 10% of his ultimate vision, would be tantamount to abandonment. Amused by Van's boundless ambition and curious about his future creations, Panamera urged him to accept, reminding him that all nobles were bound by duty to cooperate during national crises. Van eventually agreed, but mindful of his responsibilities as the local lord, he requested full authority over how his specific troop would be formed, to which the king consented. Gathering his people, Van apologized for his sudden departure and placed Espada in charge of the village. When Espada asked to join the expedition, Van gently declined, explaining that his absence would leave the village vulnerable. Instead, Van requested the accompaniment of Dee and the other knights of the Order of Cedo. Unexpectedly, several adventurers volunteered to act as escorts. Although they typically avoided military commissions, they made an exception out of respect for Van, who gratefully promised each of them 5 gold coins. Panamera then announced her need to report back to Count Ferdinand before they all gathered with the main troops to relieve Scudit. As preparations concluded, Van pondered his choice of weaponry, while Dee opted to bring a doll into battle. Departing on the first official expedition of the Knights of Cedo, Van reflected on their objective, defending the region's largest fortified city against highly experienced Yeleneta knights. Determined to prioritize the survival of his people, Van resolved to keep his forces off the front lines. Feeling a deep sense of responsibility as their lord, he promised to do everything in his power to protect them, urging everyone to value their own lives so they could safely return and continue developing the village together. Meanwhile, Marquis Jalpa, Van's father, was shocked to learn of the surprise attack on Scudit. Acknowledging the formidable challenge posed by the rival kingdom, he immediately organized a military unit and prepared to march. A subordinate reported that the nearby village governed by Van lacked soldiers and struggled for food. However, the butler interjected with recent news from a merchant. Van had slain a dragon and been elevated to the rank of baron. Dismissing the report as impossible due to his belief in his son's incompetence, the Marquis ordered an end to the chatter and commanded the immediate deployment of his forces toward the city. Upon arriving at Scudit, the defending forces were caught off guard by the enemy's deployment of dragons. Faced with this overwhelming threat, they attempted a hasty retreat, only to find themselves completely surrounded. Just as despair set in, the enemy mysteriously decided to fall back. Observing the chaotic battlefield, Dee noted her surprise at how easily Scudit had been overrun. Analyzing their battered and exhausted state, Dee advised a full retreat. Van agreed, unwilling to push anyone beyond their limits, but suggested advancing slightly to draw the enemy's attention and buy time for the retreating knights. Dee supported the tactical maneuver. When a large contingent of enemy soldiers blocked their path, Van's group fought collaboratively, successfully defeating a significant portion of the opposition. Having secured enough time, Van ordered an immediate retreat. Though some believed they could push for a victory, Van adamantly refused to let anyone risk their lives further for his sake, valuing the safe extraction of his companions above an immediate military triumph. Following the battle, Van's father remained determined to retake Scudit at any cost. When the king arrived, the Marquis apologized for the city's fall, explaining that his knights had been devastated by new enemy weaponry. He noted that while some units managed to retreat, he was unsure how they had survived. Bystanders suggested that their survival was likely due to Van's intervention. The Prime Minister corroborated this, detailing how Van had fortified his village, slain a dragon, and earned a noble title at such a young age. The Marquis was left utterly astounded, having always believed his son possessed no magical aptitude. Upon hearing of Van's exploits, his brother clenched his fist. When the king asked if he was frustrated by Van obtaining a title first, the young man sincerely replied that he was simply proud of his brother. Returning to Van and his companions, the group discussed their next steps. Van stated that while he had fulfilled his noble obligation by assisting in the defense, he knew the kingdom would suffer constant attacks unless Scudit was reclaimed. To this end, he decided to engineer new weapons to provide direct support on the battlefield, believing this material aid would serve as sufficient proof of their contribution to the war effort. After finalizing the development and preparation of these new armaments, Van scheduled their departure for early the next morning, ready to aid in the kingdom's recovery. Thank you for watching this week's anime recap. If you liked the video, please help this channel by leaving a like and subscribe to help us reach our goal of 30K subscribers.